Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned the honor and privilege of your subscription. And of course, to everybody who's watching, if you enjoy this video or get anything out of it, I would really appreciate it if you click that thumbs up button down below. And of course, if you'd like to take your support to the next level, you can visit eguitarplans.com or my Highline Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below. And any purchase you make there is going to help support this channel. And of course, if you want to keep it real simple, you can just click that thanks button down below and leave a tip in the amount that you think is fair. So what I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be continuing with the application of polymerized tung oil on the neck for my 6-string multi-scale fan fret guitar project. In the last episode, what I did was I applied the polymerized tung oil sealer, and that's soaked into the wood and will offer decent sealing protection. So what I need to do now is I'm going to apply the high luster polymerized tung oil. And what that'll do is it will allow me to build up the finish so that I can achieve a high luster and possibly slightly glossy finish. So I'm going to bring you in a little closer and I'll show you how this process is performed. All right, before I can apply the high luster tung oil, the first thing I've got to do is lightly sand the surface with some P400 grit sandpaper. And the goal here is just to knock back some of the raised grain that occurred when I applied the sealer. Now, folks usually consider raised grain to be an issue when you're using a water-based finish, and obviously tung oil is not a water-based finish. There's no water in it whatsoever. However, whenever you apply any kind of a liquid to the surface of sanded wood, any of those tiny little fibers on the surface of the wood can swell up, and then as the oil dries, the fibers become, because of they're swollen with that oil, they'll dry that way, and you can actually feel a very slight rough texture on the surface. It's not as significant as when you're using a water-based finish, but it is there. And since this is a guitar neck that we like to be really, really smooth, I need to knock it back. So I'm just going to lightly sand the entire surface, and I'm not applying much pressure, just enough to rub off that raised grain. Now, for those of you who don't know what polymerized tung oil is, it's basically just pure tung oil that has been put through a special cooking process. And what happens is it changes the molecular structure of the oil. And what that does is it allows the oil to dry and cure much faster. You see, oil like tung oil is known as a drying oil. Same thing with linseed oil. These oils, they're not like motor oil in a car. When they are applied to wood, they'll soak in and they will dry. However, they can take a long, long time to dry. They don't dry really fast. So, as a result, it can be kind of a challenge to use the oil because you have to let parts dry for such a long period of time before you can continue on with your project. But by putting it through this special heating process, the process of drying is dramatically increased. So instead of taking days or even weeks to dry and a month or more to cure, the tung oil that's been polymerized is only going to take 24 hours to dry. And then once it's dry, we can apply successive coats. So with the sealer, I applied 2 coats, which is all that was needed. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the high luster tung oil, and I'll be applying probably 4 coats. And this will be done 1 coat every 24 hours. Okay, so we've got most of the neck sanded with the 400 grit. So now what we need to do is wipe off the surface, and I'll probably even vacuum it off. Because one thing I need to do is I need to get all the sanding dust out of the fret slots. We can't leave that in there because that will impede the installation of the frets later on. Okay, now I'm going to wear nitrile gloves as I do this, because even though the oil isn't necessarily deadly toxic or anything like that, I just don't like to get the oil all over my fingers. So I'm going to wear the nitrile gloves. Okay, so I like to use these Scott Paint and Stink Cloths. They are lint-free. However, in truth, there's no such thing as a totally lint-free cloth. So what I like to do is fold these up so that the cut edges are going to be on the inside of the cloth as I apply the finish, because if there were to be any lint particles from this cloth, they're going to be at the cut edges. So by putting them on the inside, there is less of a likelihood of getting the lint particles in the finish as I'm applying it. And I like to apply a fairly liberal amount of the oil. Really soak it up into or let it soak up into the wood. And I don't worry about getting it down inside the fret slots. It's not going to cause a problem there. It's not like glue. And the nice thing about oil finishes is they are forgiving. So they're hard to mess up. And you can touch it with your gloved fingers and it's not really going to hurt anything. It's not like a nitro lacquer finish. If you touch that, you can ruin it. All right, now that's taking on a nice, deep, warm hue. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hang it up for 24 hours. And I'll let it dry before coming back and preparing to do the second coat. So through the magic of video editing, I shall be back shortly. Okay, I've said this before and I'm going to say it again. You have to dispose of oil-soaked rags properly. As the oil dries, it generates a lot of heat. And if you've got a bunch of rags and gloves all clumped together, that heat can be sufficient to cause spontaneous combustion, which in turn can burn down your workshop or your garage. And I've seen that happen to too many people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these out on a concrete floor separate from one another so that they're not touching each other, and I'm going to let them dry. You can also hang them up and let them dry that way as well. In the case of polymerized tung oil, it's going to dry in about 24 hours. After that, I can then take the rags and place them into an airtight container filled with water, and that's how I'll dispose of it. Normally, when you apply an oil type finish, you wipe on a liberal amount, you let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes, then you wipe off the excess and let it dry. However, with the polymerized tung oil from Sutherland Wells, I like to apply the first coat liberally, but instead of waiting 10 to 15 minutes and wiping off the excess, I just let it sit for 24 hours. And then I'm ready to begin the process of applying the second coat. And in this case, I'll sand the surface with 400 grit sandpaper, wipe it off thoroughly, vacuum it off. Then I'm going to apply the second coat the same way I did the first. I'll apply a liberal amount. However, from this point forward, each coat is going to be allowed to sit for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I'll wipe off the excess and let it dry. That produces a really smooth surface, and each successive coat is going to increase the build and give it a little bit shinier surface sheen. So right now, after just one coat, it has a satin sheen to it. But once I continue building with additional coats, it's going to start to build more of a gloss. Now you can use a tack rag to wipe off the excess, but you can also just use a plain paper towel with some mineral spirits. And then after wiping it off with the mineral spirits, I'll just take a clean cloth to wipe off the excess mineral spirits. Okay, and now I'm ready to apply the second coat. And it's essentially applied the same way as the first coat. I'll be using Scott lint-free cloths. Folding that cut edge in towards the center. And again, I'm going to apply a fairly liberal amount. Okay, now I'm going to hang it up and let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes. Okay, so the neck has been hanging up here for about 15 minutes now. So I'm going to take a clean cloth and I'm going to wipe off as much of the excess oil as I can. And now I'm going to let it hang here for another 24 hours. And I'll repeat this exact same process again. However, when I go to sand before applying the third coat, I'm going to sand with 600 grit instead of 400 grit. So each successive coat will be sanded with a progressively finer grit to get an even smoother and potentially shinier surface. Okay guys, I'm not going to show you each step in the process of applying this finish. And the reason is because they are all exactly the same as what I just showed you. The only thing that changes is the grit of the sandpaper that I use before applying each additional coat. So before I applied the second coat, I sanded the surface with 400 grit. When I go to apply the third coat, I'm going to sand the surface with 600 grit. And then when I go to apply the fourth coat, I'll sand the surface with 800 grit. And at that point, that's really as far as I need to go. However, it really depends on the level of sheen that I want to achieve on this neck. Now, don't confuse luster with sheen. That's two different things. Luster is the degree of warmth and richness that the finish lends to the wood, and sheen is how reflective the surface is. So the product I'm using is going to impart a very high degree of luster, but it's probably only going to give it a satin sheen. If I want to take it further, I can. I just have to apply more coats. So once I've applied that fourth coat, I would continue to add 3 to 4 more coats on top of that. And between each of those coats, I would only have to sand with the 800 grit. I wouldn't have to progress any further because 800 is just fine as it is. But then once I have finished applying, it would be a total of 8 coats. I could then let that dry thoroughly, and then I would sand it with like 1,000 grit, and then I'd take it to my buffing machine and buff it up to a high gloss shine. However, with guitar necks, I like to go with a satin sheen. I don't like to take it any further than that. Glossy sheens tend to start to feel a little bit sticky, and I like the smooth satin feel that the tung oil lends to the neck in its natural state without having to buff it out. So that's probably where I'm going to end this episode. So what's going to happen in the next episode is, in the beginning, I'll show you the neck finished with the tung oil done and ready for the installation of the frets. And then I'll start installing the frets. So hopefully you'll continue to watch this series as the 6-string multi-scale guitar build comes to fruition. And if you enjoyed this video or got anything out of it, please give it a thumbs up. Visit the eGuitar Plans web store. Visit the Highline Guitars merch store. There's links in the description below. Click the thanks button. And of course, if you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that I've earned the honor and privilege of your subscription. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll all be back for more guitar building videos.